Good evening. Happy you are here. It will be an interesting talk, not too scholarly, but a little bit demanding too. And the exhibits that I need, I will refer to. They're all on this table here. So when the talk is over, you can look at everything that you've heard firsthand. Because the adventures I'm talking about are about things that either are here or could have been here and are not. In fact, I have to say, fortunately, you'll hear that story too. In an introduction to his masterful lecture in this very room a few weeks ago, our illustrious Princeton University colleague Peter Brown said something like this. One day in my early time here at Princeton, I entered Speer Library, and in a sense, I did not leave it ever since. Now, this has certainly been my experience. I came to Princeton Seminary partly because of its library, and my wife and I did not leave Princeton after my retirement for the very same reason. Princeton Seminary's library, even more so in its present magnificent shell, is an incredible treasure chest, full of hidden treasure. And we, the users, have the key to unlock this wealth and take advantage. We celebrate Theological Library Month this October thanks to the foresight and determination of successive administrations and the generosity of innumerable friends over 2 centuries. This library is one of the finest of its kind in this country, I would even say in the world. Of course, there are people who feel that libraries are the epitome of what is boring in life, the place where you sit down for hours and hours and have nothing around you but books, stuffy, musty, lifeless, not even moving like the images on TV. But for me and many others, perhaps for all of you here, a library is a wonderful place, full of excitement, of surprises, even of drama and adventure. Tonight I would like to share some of my adventures in this wonderland, the land of Princeton Seminary's library. My first contacts with Princeton Seminary came through a towering figure in the history of the Presbyterian Church in this country, Professor Edward A. Dowie. I was teaching at Drew, it's 40 miles north of here, and Ed Dowie came to Madison regularly to visit his friend John Dillenberger, in whose house I first met him. Ed and my colleague Franz Hildebrand, who had been a close friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in student days, were actively promoting the idea of a bi-monthly meeting of faculty members from Drew and from Princeton for theological conversation. We took turns meeting in Princeton and Madison and had intense debates about God and the world. When during the Drew crisis of 1968, Dr. James McCord, then president of Princeton Seminary, wanted to talk to me, Ed Dowie paid me an unexpected visit at our house in Madison, persuasively extolling the virtues of Princeton and praising especially the seminary's library. He knew of my interest in medieval manuscripts. I had just returned from a summer in the monastic library on the island of Patmos. And he mentioned that a colleague at Princeton, Bruce Metzger, had written his doctoral dissertation on a medieval lectionary in the possession of Speer Library. Metzger, he pointed out, was a fine philologist who read, in addition to Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, other ancient languages such as Syriac, Coptic, and Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia. I was duly impressed. During one of my first visits with Bruce, I asked him about the lectionary and his dissertation. He kindly went to the library with me, showed me the treasure, and we read a few lines together. It's right here, the first volume on this shelf. Modestly and almost apologetically, he remarked that it was only yeoman's work of biblical scholarship that he had been doing, but I appreciated the enormous amount of painstaking research which such a project required. After the hour spent with him, I was excited, but also a little disappointed, and that for 3 reasons. First, I had expected that the manuscript, like to many other lectionaries, was full of miniatures and intriguing decorations. Well, this manuscript only displays one large illumination on the first folio, and that folio was inserted into the volume at some later time from elsewhere. Bruce told me that. Second, I was looking toward seeing other medieval manuscripts which the seminary might own. But, as Bruce said, it was the only one. Third, yes, Bruce did his degree work in the classics department at Princeton University and had considerable praise for Professor Coleman Norton, under whom the dissertation was written. But he did not mention Kurt Weitzmann in the Department of Art History, the foremost expert in Byzantine book illumination. I knew that Weitzmann taught at Princeton University through my Drew colleague, Howard Clark Key, who had been with Weitzmann on one of the first Mount Sinai expeditions in the 1950s. You may know they cataloged the icons at St. Catherine's Monastery at that time. Weitzmann did this for 3 years with a group of people who went over there, and Key was one of the people with Weitzmann there. In addition, the private library of Harvard art historian Wilhelm Köhler, which Drew acquired at that time and I cataloged for the Drew Library, contained many of Weitzmann's publications. I sampled a few and was particularly intrigued by an article on the illustrations of the Septuagint. Do you know that? There are lots of manuscripts that have pictures on the Septuagint. It was clear to me that I would love to meet this author someday. Well, I did fairly soon after moving to Princeton and in the years thereafter, but I never dreamed that much later another link to Weitzmann in this work would materialize in our family. When in 1994, Kurt Weitzmann's widow, Josepha Weitzmann-Fiedler, planned to republish her husband's groundbreaking study on Byzantine book illumination, first published in Berlin in 1934, she asked our daughter, Johanna, I think because of recommendation by Peter Brown, to help her with the proofing and correcting of Kurt Weitzmann's handwritten German manuscript of the appendix in his supplement, which were to be included in the new issue published in Vienna in 1996. Now, during that memorable clandestine visit of Ed Dowey at our house in Madison, I showed Ed one of my own treasures, a first edition in 1 volume of Heinrich Bullinger's commentaries on the Gospels of Matthew and John, printed by Christoph Froschauer at Zurich in Switzerland in 1542 and 1543. This had been a gift to us by Ricardo's father when we moved to the U.S., taking something along with us from Zurich. We were living near Basel at that time. Ed, when he saw that volume, and it's right there, it's the second one, Ed was mesmerized. And really, throughout the years, he envied me this possession always. Whenever he came, he wanted to see it. It's a wonderful volume, as you will see. I did not know at that time that Bulinger was Ed Dowie's favorite reformer and a lifelong object of his scholarly endeavors. A monograph on Bulinger was the last major project on his shelf for years. I now regret that I did not give the stately volume as a gift to my beloved colleague while he was alive, but I did donate it to Speer Library in 2010. That's why it's here now and can be shown. Speer did not have the very important John commentary of the Zurich Reformer. The Matthew they did have, but not John, and that's the more important one among Bullinger's commentaries. I have to say that the item has not yet been properly catalogued, and it's really worth being worked on in some depth. It has a number of very interesting features. For example, in the binding, there are remnants from a medieval liturgical and juristic manuscript. You still can see it. That's what binders used inside of the spine, and they used simply old manuscripts which had been discarded and cut them up. But in addition to extensive marginal notes in this volume, which include several early 17th century sermons penned in the margin, well, in addition to these sermons in German and in Latin, it contains also a number of owner's entries which document in unusual detail the fate of this book in the 16th and early 17th centuries. We don't always have this for books. It seems that eventually it went from the first owner in Zurich, quite appropriate, that's where Bulinger was, to a man named Jakob Ritter. He lived from 1543 to 1610, a well-known Lutheran, but finally a Reformed pastor in the vicinity of Basel, who probably penned most of the marginalia there. Now, in the 1980s, I was working with an international team of scholars on the manuscripts of the so-called Glossa Ordinaria, the glossed or annotated Bible of the Middle Ages, which every scholar and preacher from the 12th to the 16th century consulted, and which in itself was a marvel of ingenious book production. A full set of gloss manuscripts on the whole Bible would have amounted to no less than 21 or 23 volumes, and was quite rare. Most medieval libraries owned but a few parts, perhaps the Pentateuch, Prophets, or the Gospels. Now, rather than waiting for the manuscript work to be finished and then proceed to a critical edition on that basis, a British colleague and I, we decided as a preliminary step to publish a photostatic reprint of the first printed gloss, which appeared anonymously in Strasbourg in 1480. The genius of that edition consisted in the fact that for the first time it reduced this immense material, think of 21 volumes in manuscript, it reduced all this to 4 volumes, which could be reproduced in multiple copies, printed, and marketed everywhere in Europe at a reasonable price. Gloss manuscripts were extremely expensive. Our 4-volume reprint with introductions saw the light in 1992, was published by Brepols in Belgium. The Princeton Seminary Library, of course, has it on the shelves. When I was tracing the details of this wonder work of late medieval printing, and that's the third one there, pretty big, as you see. Well, these are stately volumes. A binder always had something to do. I was awed by the achievement. The printer, we know it must have been Adolf Rusch of Ingweiler in Alsace, single-handedly planned and executed the complicated layout of the volumes as a hypertext, which combined snippets of Vulgate in a large print with the appropriate marginal and interlinear glosses on the same page, using an ingenious system of reference marks. You can look at this afterwards and can see it. One of the persons who does the HTML work on making medieval manuscripts readable today, he said that when he gives a talk on hypertext, he always uses a page of this edition as an example of the earliest attempts to get hypertext done. Well, this was a logistical task of mind-boggling proportions. The effort must have taken many months. But there is more. When I inspected a number of copies of the Ruschgloss in European libraries one summer, I was astonished to find amazingly few printing errors in the text. The proofing apparently had been done with utmost care. It is known through correspondence that Rusch employed the women of his household as proofreaders. Both his wife and his daughter were well-educated and extremely competent readers. They have my highest admiration. Now, since printing errors can be very important helps in identifying manuscript sources in early prints, I decided to pursue that issue of printing errors in the Ruschgloss some more. Back in Princeton, I found, much to my delight, that I was in the perfect place here for comparative work on several copies. While a number of places in the U.S. could boast of owning one copy or even two copies of the Ruschgloss, Princeton had three. One at the seminary, one at Firestone, and one at the Scheide Library. The seminary copy, this one over here, is a very fine copy indeed, stately, with an unidentified coat of arms, probably of the first owner, on a folded extension of each volume's first folio. Now just think of that. Can you show that, or Don? The first folio is prolonged. What does that mean? It means that already at the time when this volume was bought, the printer has made sure that some first pages were longer than the others, in order for owners to allow them to put down, a coat of arms. It's a very simple but a good device. It's good marketing indeed. Now, in the late 16th century, these volumes were owned by a man by the name of Vitus Prüfer, a counter-Reformation theologian who served as a cathedral canon and a papal visitor general to the Diocese of Eichstätt in Bavaria. The Firestone copy was owned by a priest in the Rhineland near Aachen who gave it as memorial gift as early as 1485. That means we have already a record of 1485 where one of these four volumes was given to someone else. That's quite early, 5 years after it was printed. The Scheide copy was at one time part of the rich library of the Premonstratensen monastery in Wedinghausen, which is in Westphalia, which was dispersed after its secularization in 1803. When I checked the three Princeton copies, some printing errors I had identified in Europe, I made a very odd discovery. The errors were present. Well, as one would expect. But they were present in two of the Princeton copies, but not in our copy here in the seminary. How strange. Only now did I notice that time and again in the first two volumes, lines on the same page would not begin or end with the same word. The length of the line was then adjusted by the use of different contractions or expansions of the Latin abbreviations in order to return to the original text flow 2 lines later. Do you get the picture? the pages are not the same because the last word of a line is not the one which is in another copy. Well, what do you have to do? In Latin, the contractions and expansions are a major means of regulating the length of a line. The line has to be justified. So they did this, but after two lines, then the thing is as it always was before. This astonishing phenomenon of the same page coming in two different forms allows for only one conclusion. The printer had reset the pages. What an incredible amount of duplicated work. In fact, it appeared that the entire first volume, like this one over there, as well as several gatherings of the second, were reset at least one time, maybe more. And there is a simple explanation for this procedure. After printing one volume, the matrix plates from which you print had to be broken up in order to make the movable letters available for the typesetting of the next volume. Get that? You just need type, tiny little pieces. You break up the old one and you use it now for the second volume. Well, thus the printer had no choice but to reset the earlier volumes if the demand for the set of 4 continued after the first one was sold. Now, business seems to have been quite good for Adolf Rusch, but at an incredible cost of double or even triple labor. Recalling my adventures at Princeton Seminary Library, I would be amiss if I did not give due credit to Bill Harris. Bill Harris, known to some of you here, not everyone, of course, the indefatigable and incomparable guardian of its special collections over many years. Bill's social skills were extraordinary, and his curiosity was limitless. He was never shy in calling upon his colleagues' gifts and challenging their perceived skills to the full when he was trying to solve problems he encountered. I'll give you an example. That's the next book there. Bill Harris called me and said, "Listen, I have a sizable volume of handwritten sermons in German. Pretty old, it seems. Would you come in sometime and take a look at it?" Well, at first sight, I looked at the book. I determined it was a postil, one of those countless books for devotional reading at home, which generations of Protestant lay people have used ever since the Reformation. An inscription on the first page said that these were sermons on the gospel lessons, quote, preached by the godly man Michael Hiller, pastor zum Zoten, who passed away, quote, in the year 1557. Now, I could not remember or find in any of the standard bibliographical tools a 16th century pastor of that name, and the name of his parish did not ring a bell. The content did not seem noteworthy either. It was devotional biblical interpretation, quite moralistic at times. Of course, the collection was not without value. It might be a primary source for our knowledge of popular piety and preaching in the early decades of the Reformation. I simply laid the volume aside for the time being. Two things, however, kept nagging me, at least in my subconscious. The early date of the book, think of that, late 16th, late 16th century, which seemed to be confirmed by the handwriting when I inspected it, and then that odd place name, zum Zoten, which in English would mean at the Zote, Z-O-T-E. Where in Europe would that be? Now, no gazetteer gave me any clue. Talking with my wife a few months later, I suggested, over the breakfast table, more in jest than in earnest, that I remembered a little mountain ridge in Silesia, now Poland, not far from my childhood home in eastern Saxony, which had a similar odd-sounding name, Der Zobten, the Zobten Ridge, Z-O-B-T-E-N. Checking an encyclopedia for information on its exact location, I found that it was not far from Breslau in Silesia and also went by the name of Zota among the locals. Zota? Did the inscription at volume mean to say that the author of the sermons was a pastor in the parish at the Zobten Ridge? Suddenly a path into the mystery opened up, and the volume took on a new aura as it began to yield its hidden story. During a visit to Speer Library, I checked the section on local church histories, Silesia. Yes, all the standard works, of course, were there and not even checked out. What I learned was totally unexpected and quite exciting, at least for a historian. Michael Hiller, I read, was a very important figure in the tortuous history of the Reformation in that remote part of the empire. He was indeed priest and pastor at the parish of Zobten am Bober in Lower Silesia, with its several villages, from at least 1511 to his death in 1557. He had been ordained by the Catholic Bishop of Breslau, but he developed sympathies for Luther's cause early on and joined the Reformation party in the territory. His real significance, however, was his connection with the person and theological convictions of Kaspar Schwenkfeld, a reformer of Silesia, who, as a spiritualist, eventually turned into a critic of Luther in regard to doctrines such as Eucharist, Christology, and sanctification, and was exiled from the area. Now, in 1530, Hiller married Elizabeth von Lest, a relative of Schwenkfeld. This greatly enhanced his appeal for Schwenkfeld's supporters in the Bober Valley. It seems that the ardent Schwenkfelders in the region trusted him as a pastor who was a friend and an ally, although he never joined their separatist circles and never lost his appointment in the old church under the Bishop of Breslau. That was possible. They flocked to hear him preach. They treasured the copies of his sermons and prayers and would quote him in their later controversies with Lutheran, Calvinist, and Catholic authorities. In the early 18th century, persecutions by the Lutheran establishment exiled them from Silesia to Upper Lusatia across the Saxon border, where, as you may know, Count Zinzendorf had already provided asylum to Bohemian refugees. They were less fortunate than the Moravians. Under pressure from the Catholic emperor, the Saxon king ordered them out of the country. Well, where were they to go? After weighing the options, the group decided to emigrate to the New World, to Pennsylvania. The main contingent sailing in 1734 and settling around Allentown near the New Jersey border. The Schwenkfelder Church is still alive and active in 5 congregations in that area. Their main center, school, and their archives are located at Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. The Schwenkfelder Library there holds some manuscripts similar to ours, but one entire section of Lenten sermons is only found in the Princeton copy. Looking at that tattered book again, I could imagine the former owner, and it gives her name, Anna Rosina Bakes, a Schwenkfelder woman of the 18th or early 19th century, gathering her family around a tiled stove on a bleak winter evening in Pennsylvania Dutch country and reading to them from this treasure of their past. Her granddaughter apparently got hold of the book when she was a child in the 1820s or 1830s and was looking for some paper to draw on. The first leaves are decorated with some casual pencil drawings. I think, yeah, can you show that? There are some pencil drawings right there. And you, page is loose, yeah, okay, yeah, you can look at it afterwards. They show the interior of a home where all the windows on the 3 floors are draped with neat curtains, and period people in their Sunday best, fancy dresses and hats are walking across the page. Well, perhaps the Schwenkfelder girl was dreaming of a wedding. As befits a theological library, the Princeton Seminary Library has significant selections of Bibles, of course, in many languages and from several countries. I have a little story on 2 of them. The first one really puzzled Bill Harris, and he asked for my advice. Marion Lehmann, she was the wife of Paul Lehmann of blessed memory, one of the great people at Union Seminary, but he also, I think, taught here, right, for a while. He did, yeah. Great preacher. Marion Lehmann, the widow of Paul Lehmann, had given this set to the seminary and had said it was valuable because it had belonged to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The Bible consisted of 2 volumes in an artful, modern leather binding. It's over there. And it contained, according to the title page in 16th century black letter, the first complete Luther Bible printed in 1534. Well, this in itself would have been a splendid gift. Bill Harris, however, had some doubts because while the paper was unusually thick, the books looked fresh and new, not like treasures from the 16th century. Well, in fact, I found out right away by reading a short German note printed in the back that it was a beautiful facsimile edition, printed and bound in Leipzig in 1934 in celebration of the 400th anniversary of its first appearance. The dedication leaf pasted on the inside cover of Volume 1 documented that these books, it's the Bible in 2 books, were a gift to Dietrich Bonhoeffer on his 31st birthday, February 4, 1937. The 28 signatures were those of the members of the 4th class of young ministerial candidates enrolled at the clandestine seminary in Finkenwalde in Pomerania, which Bonhoeffer at that time directed. Among them are the names of some well-known theologians and churchmen of later years, such as Eberhard Bethge, Gerhard Ebeling, and Gerhard Krause. There also was a handwritten note on the first flyleaf of both volumes, which read, Eigentum, which means property, Eberhard Bethge, 23 Manor Mount, London, SE 23. Now, this address is that of the parsonage of the German Lutheran Church of St. Paul in Sydenham, which Bonhoeffer served from 1933 to 35, and his friend and biographer Bethge after the war from 1953 to 1960. I suggested to Bill that Bethge must have taken with him to London a number of Bonhoeffer's books, which he had catalogued and in his own care in the early 50s. He states that in his memoirs. I had no idea, however, how they made it from there to America. Well, Bill Harris, who was always resourceful, found out by himself that on the occasion of a lecture he delivered at Union Seminary in New York, probably in the late 1950s, Bethge presented these 2 volumes to Paul Lehmann as a token of gratitude for Paul's help in securing a Danforth grant for him to finish his well-known Bonhoeffer biography in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's the story of this wonderful gift which was given to us by Mrs. Lehmann. The second Bible I want to mention was a gift to the Seminary's Library by Mr. and Mrs. Geese of Monroe Township, made in 2002. I sent my memo with the identifications to Bill Harris on the last day of his tenure as Special Librarian and Archivist on June 24, 2002. The old German Bible, as Bill had described it to me, was mutilated. It was lacking the first pages, including the title, and everything after 1 Timothy 4. It turned out to be a relatively rare copy of the 1540 edition of the so-called Zurich Bible, which occupies an important place in the history of this German Bible translation, the Zurich Bible. It's still used as the regular reading Bible in Swiss churches, even in worship there. In the early years of the Zurich Reformation, Zwingli and his friends used the available parts of Luther's German translation, which the Zurich printer Christoph Froschauer published in a form adapted to the Swiss German dialect. In the years after 1527, Luther's own efforts at translating the missing parts were slowing down. The first edition of the complete Luther Bible in German, as we saw, appeared in 1534. Now, in the meantime, the Zurich theologians, on the other hand, worked on new translations themselves. In the context of the Prophecy, as it was called, there was a daily Bible study session in the Grossmünster of Zurich, the city's main church, in which Zwingli took the leading part. When Froschauer published the first complete Swiss German Bible in an octavo format, March of 29, 5 years before the full Luther Bible, it featured revised and adapted Luther translations as well as original new Zurich translations. The latter for the books of the prophets, Proverbs, Psalms, which Zwingli did, and the Song of Songs. The year 1531 then saw the publication of Froschauer's great Folio Bible, for which the Zurich theologians produced entirely new translations of all the poetical books, Job to Song of Songs. It is famous for its beautiful typography and its 200 woodcut illustrations, half of which were contributed by none other than Hans Holbein the Younger. I don't think we have it. I checked, but couldn't really find that we have this 1531 edition. This 1531 edition was thoroughly revised according to the original Hebrew and Greek texts by Zwingli's friend and collaborator Leo Jude, pastor at St. Peter's in Zurich, who consulted a converted Jew, Michael Adam, for the Old Testament, and the biblical writings of Erasmus for the New. This definitive form of the Zurich Bible was printed by Froschauer in 1540. It became the basic standard for the reprints of many decades. And Princeton Seminary's Library is fortunate to have a copy of the original, the 1540 Zurich Bible. Now, among its Bibles, the Seminary Library does own a copy of Erasmus's celebrated first edition of the Greek New Testament, printed at Basel by Johann Froben in 1516. It is over there. I think it's the last one, right? Last one. Yeah, it's the last one. Erasmus called it, and that's a Latin title, Novum Instrumentum Omne, not Novum Testamentum Omne. He called it the New Complete Tool. Well, that's an odd title. It reveals that Erasmus did not prepare his edition of the Greek New Testament for its own sake, but he published it as a supporting tool for his Latin text, his revision of the Vulgate. The volume actually, as you'll see, is bilingual. On the left, you have the Greek text. On the right, the Latin. It's well known that Erasmus completed this book very much in haste because he was in a competitive race with the Spanish project of the Complutensian polyglot. the first part of which, the New Testament with its Greek text, had already been printed in 1514, but it had not yet entered the market because they were waiting for the Old Testament to get ready, and it was not yet. But in the meantime, Erasmus had secured, clever as he was, a 4-year exclusive privilege for his edition from Emperor Maximilian and Pope Leo X in 1516. The Complutensian Greek New Testament, therefore, appeared as part of the entire set only 4 years later, 1520. For his Greek text, Erasmus compared several manuscripts he found in Basel, haphazard. This is what he found. However, for the book of Revelation, he had only one manuscript. And in this manuscript, the last leaf happened to be missing. It's somewhat ironic to learn that for the first critical edition of the Greek New Testament, Erasmus did not wait for another complete manuscript to turn up. He simply sat down and translated the last 6 verses of Revelation back into Greek from his Latin Vulgate. When Martin Luther translated the Greek Testament into German and published his translation as the September Testament of 1522, he used Erasmus's second Greek edition, 1519, which of course did not have that awkward end of Revelation in there, which he had retranslated himself. Tyndale, on the other hand, his first English translation from the Greek was based on that first hasty edition of 1516. Now, the Princeton Library also has a number of Erasmus's New Testament paraphrases. They're well known in early printed copies, and it has a very precious 1-volume first edition of Cyprian's works, published in 1520. That's a treasure, of course. Now, sometime in the fall of 98, Bill Harris called me and asked me to stop by and check out a fantastic volume, as he put it. When I came, Bill had on the table a large book in a typical 16th century binding, like this first one over there, which he opened carefully to display, much to my amazement, page after page of dense manuscript notes written in a faded red ink in the margin of the beautifully printed folios. Quite an exciting sight, I tell you. Well, the fabulous book turned out to be volume 8 of the famous edition of St. Augustine's works which Erasmus had prepared and Johann Froben had printed in Basel in 10 volumes, 1528 and 1529. This volume contained Augustine's En Rationis in Psalmos, the Church Fathers' extensive Psalms commentary. Bill told me in a low voice that the owner, an American scholar and book dealer living in Paris, was offering the entire set of 10 volumes to the seminary at the price of $1 million, because he was convinced that the marginalia in this, but also in other volumes, represented hitherto unknown and unpublished texts by none other than Martin Luther. Bill had informed the president and the board, and there was interest, as it was before this library was decided on. Understandably, Bill and the Princeton authorities wanted to be sure that the enormous asking price was justified. The owner himself, while posing as an expert in ancient prints, was not able to read the script. But he had obtained some tentative transcriptions with the help of others. Examining these notes myself, I could see that in the margin of every psalm Augustine was commenting, the annotator had written in 2 sets of additional commentary in German, which he regularly titled summarium, the first little paragraph, and aliud, which would be another one. And if you supply, aliud summarium, another summary. So there was always a summarium, and then there was an aliud underneath. Well, let me see, I had to admit, after studying a few examples, that these texts were very Lutheran indeed, clearly in tune with Luther's theology during the Reformers' middle years. They were pastorally sensitive and stylistically very well formulated. At Bill Harris's request, my wife Ricarda and I began transcribing the aliud sections psalm by psalm because, yes, I should have said that, a scholar in Switzerland already had identified the first set, the Summaria, as manuscript versions of Luther's treatise Summaria über die Psalmen und Ursache des Dolmetschens. That was printed in 1533. The origin of these aliud texts, however, was totally unknown. So we sat down at Bill's request and started reading, poring over this minuscule handwriting several hours every day for almost a month, and becoming more and more impressed by the theological depth and the literary quality of these brief expositions. Was it not possible that Martin Luther was indeed the author? Were we not actually in the presence of an incredible hoard of unpublished primary material authored by the Wittenberg reformer and carefully copied out by this annotator? He must have been a close friend or associate of Luther, and he copied all of this in the margin of this volume. I tried to match the script with published samples of the handwriting of as many Reformation figures as I could find. No result. I checked all known German Psalms commentaries from the 1520s and 1530s as far as I could locate them in this country, and I failed to find these texts. Only a few published pieces were still on my list of items to look up, among them a Kurzsummaria, short summaries and Auszüge and excerpts of the Psalms, which would have been written by Wenceslaus Link of Nuremberg, a fellow Augustinian of Luther's and a good friend of Luther's. This was printed in 1527, but no copy seemed to be held in the library on this side of the Atlantic. On a Sunday evening in October, I was searching online, well, at that time that was existing, the catalog of the University of Tübingen, where I intended to work in the spring. And if they had it, I would have looked up the Psalms commentary there. Well, it listed, that Tübingen catalog listed over 60 most short publications under the name of Wenzel Link. He, after all, was a southern German. That's an impressive number for a collection of 16th century prints, but the 1527 Psalms pamphlet was not among them. At the bottom, however, of that list, it mentioned a modern collection called Link's Kleine Schriften, published in an obscure Dutch Germanistic series in 1973. Well, a quick check of the Firestone catalog online confirmed that the Princeton University Library subscribed to that series. They have a good Germanistic department. Knowing that Firestone Library was open till 11 o'clock at night, I mounted my bicycle, rode a few blocks to the campus, and located the series on the A floor. The volume was not checked out. The series was there, thank God. I opened the volume at random. On the page before me were brief interpretations of biblical psalms. And a few pages farther, I found the comments on Psalm 80, the very texts we had transcribed from the margins of the Augustine volume the day before. The mystery of the aliud was solved, and the dream of $1 million dissolved. like a white cloud in a blue sky. Princeton returned the precious volume and regretfully declined the offer. This story has a sequel. 3 years ago, spring of 2010, I received an email from the rare book librarian in the University Library in Basel, Switzerland. He had read in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, FAZ, that's one of the leading German daily newspapers, he had read there a glowing report about an original Erasmus edition of Augustine's works with hundreds of contemporary marginal notes, which was scheduled to be auctioned off at Sotheby's in Paris with an estimated price tag of 200,000 euro. Since my name was mentioned in the article as that of a person who had worked on the transcription, and Mr. Dill knew me well, he was asking confidentially whether Basel should get in on the bidding for this volume, for this set in June. After all, the set was printed in Basel and would be a desirable acquisition of great local importance. I replied by simply telling him my story, in which he was understandably very interested. Basel did not bid. At the auction, touted as a major event by the European press, there was a fierce and tense bidding war. The 10 Augustine volumes finally went for 325,000 euro and were deposited by the new owner in the University Library of Zurich, Switzerland. I was able to revisit the treasure there in 2012 in the presence of the proud Zurich colleague who had bought it at the Paris auction. Understandably, he was a little disappointed when he heard what my experience had been. Now, you can see why I do not think the library is a dull and boring place. No, the treasure chest is still open and is waiting to surprise and delight the eager and curious user at every turn. Many libraries today have become haughty snobs who turn up their noses at the humble and expectant crowd that wants to enjoy what's being offered and think that should be easy. They shelve their new acquisitions by accession date. You can locate what you need for your project through a search in several catalogs or a number of search fields online, but you can't go there to look. Not so at the two Princeton libraries. The books are still shelved according to subject matter at Firestone and at the seminary. I always inspect what is shelved next to the book I'm interested in, the new and shining bindings in order to keep up with what's new in the field, and the old and faded spines because they often cover surprising gems of insight, which it would be a pity to miss. Some years ago, a colleague in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study confessed to me that he was quite unhappy with the libraries at Princeton. In order to get a book, he said, "Oh, you have to walk miles and miles." What a nuisance. It was easier at home. You simply fill out a request form, dropped it in a box, and bingo, the next day it was sitting on the circulation desk for you to pick up. Well, I have to say I prefer the adventure of roaming through Princeton Seminary's library land, where the roads are well paved. The signs, even in this newly settled territory, start to make sense, and where I do get my daily exercise, which I need. And when I really get lost, there's always Kate Scrivatinas. Yes, thanks, Kate. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, all you staff people of this wonderful place here in Princeton Theological Library Month reminds us of the incredible treasure chest we have right here on campus. It's good, and it's always to our advantage to spend much time right here in this building, long days and hours. And you're probably aware of it, not all is books around here. You now even can eat lunch, and the coffee machine is always ready. What more can you want? Thank you very much.